I'm going to have to update my bio for you because I'm in my 5th year as the Victims Assistance Coordinator, and I actually finished that master's degree in 2019. So I'm getting older faster than seems fair, but thank you for that lovely introduction. And it seems to me somewhere in the correspondence around planning this, there was some talk about an honorarium or a stipend, and I would really like you to just put that in your donation category to keep this going next spring, okay? So save some paperwork and all of that, and we'll just keep feeding back into that. So thank you so much for having me back. For some of you, I may be a repeat performance here. If you were at the last talk that I gave, it was a little over a year ago now, I think, and it was focused on mental health and spirituality. And this time we're going to focus in a little bit more specifically on trauma. I really don't plan to talk in a very particular way about specific traumatic events per se, but we are talking about that topic. So do be careful and monitor yourselves in terms of what is comfortable and what isn't. And I hope that this will be a good process for you to think about trauma in the context of your faith. My final paper for my master's was on trauma-informed theology, which is a relatively new idea. And it was a very interesting and integrative process for me to go through, to take my background as a clinician and connect that in a meaningful way to the theology studies that I'd been engaged in up at Gonzaga, and then to think about all of that in particular relationship to the work that I do for the Archdiocese. So it was a real wonderful time for me of integration and cohesion, and that's a key characteristic of mental health, is that sense of integration and cohesion in your life narrative. And it was certainly a good moment for me in that process, and one that's, I think, really empowered me in ways for service in my ministry that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. So I'm very grateful to have been able to do that. Okay, I've completely forgotten. Is it Brianda? I can't see my slides. Can we start those now? Great, thank you so much. I feel a little bit like God. I just ask for something and there it is, right? That's rather remarkable. I really do need you to come help me with my tech at home. So we're going to touch on what it's like to live through trauma. And I chose that topic very specifically because there's a tendency in our world today to expect people to get over things and to get over them on our timeline, whatever that might be. And I hear that a lot in my work for the Archdiocese with clergy abuse survivors, in particular because so many of the victim survivors that I'm working with are as old as I am, which means in their 60s. Some of them are older, some of them are younger, but for most of them, the abuse that they're reporting to me and that we're working on in supporting and caring for them happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so they've often heard from family, friends, sometimes professionals, why aren't you over that yet? Why it's so long ago? Why do you carry that with you? And the reason is because trauma has a very profound impact on us as individuals, and it will vary depending on the nature of the trauma, the duration of the trauma, who or what perpetrated the trauma. Those are all factors that cause different outcomes. But the bottom line is trauma is impactful and it can change us in very fundamental ways. And especially when that happens to us as young, very young people, it can also be literally rewiring our brains. So it's not something you just get over. And it's not something that you forgive and forget and move on from. And so that brought me to the musings and the subtitle that you have here in front of you. And that is, let's talk about where's God in this? What does it mean to be present if you will? And how about resilience? What is it that helps us get through our traumas, and then carry on with hope for the future? Because trauma is not the bell that you can unring. It really is. Once it's been rung, it's rung. And it becomes something that you carry with you. And the question then really becomes how? How are you going to carry that forward with you? How much space is it going to occupy? How much impact is it going to have? And our faith can be at the heart of helping to determine a lot of that. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If we can go to the next slide, this is just a little bit about me, so you know who's talking to you, and how I, as a lifelong learner and spiritual sojourner, am still on a journey and learning. So I really am going to share musings with you tonight. I'm not giving definitive answers on those things. I'm really hoping that I give you something to think about, and hopefully something that will feel like it resonates for you, either personally or in a relationship that you're in, for someone you care about. So you can see a lot of transition and growth going on in my life. I was actually born into an Anglican family in Canada. When we moved to the United States, we became Episcopalian. And then I married a wonderful man, and we're now, let's see, this is 2020. We're 37 years married, and he's a cradle Catholic. And so that pushed some discussions and challenges to us. And I went through RCIA, and ultimately I was confirmed as a Catholic when our oldest daughter was about 18 months old. I started my life and education in psychology, and as you heard, I've just recently completed a degree in theology. I've either been in the classroom as a student or a teacher for most of my life. I have officially grown up, and so have my kids. I now have 2 daughters who are married, one of whom got married in a very unexpected COVID way, because we were 4 days away from her wedding when the pandemic shutdown hit in California. So that wedding got canceled, and we managed to pull off another wedding on a much smaller scale in May. And my other daughter, who got married last year, is going to give us a grandbaby in the next 3 weeks. So soon I will be not just daughter, wife, mother, but also grandmother. So that's kind of the background on who I am. And I share that only because I find it helps me to connect with a speaker or a writer, and know a little bit about what their perspective is and where it may or may not inform my own. And then, of course, the last thing on there is that I am a dog lover. You see me there with Winnie and Teddy. Winnie is still here with me. She's actually curled up right next to me. Teddy now lives with my daughter. Turns out both Winnie and Teddy are better off being only children than siblings in the same house. So let's move on to the next slide. And I really do want to ground this with this idea of musings. I am a person of faith, as I'm sure is obvious from all of what's been said already, but that wasn't an easy thing to be when I was in graduate school. USC is a wonderful school, and I had a good experience there. But clinical psychology at that point in time was completely secular. At least in the legitimate, well-respected programs, it was secular. And so there was never any discussion of spirituality or faith in my training or in any of my coursework, other than to say, don't talk about it, don't impose yours on anyone else. It doesn't belong in the therapy room, so to speak. Thankfully, we've done a complete 180 on that kind of thinking. And so now we have psychologists who actually research the value of spirituality in mental health, the role of spirituality in mental health. And that's a good bit of what I talked about the last time I was with you all. So these are musings from me as a faith-filled psychologist and as a person who really does resonate with the words of Teilhard de Chardin when he said, "We are spiritual beings having a human experience." So that's sort of my starting place. So let's go to the next slide. And what I'd like you to just, I hope this will just sort of wash over you as you start to think about, in general, how it is you envision God's presence in your life. When you center yourself at the beginning of prayer, as we did tonight, and put yourself with intention in God's presence, what does that look like for you? What does that mean to you? And hopefully I'm going to offer some ideas to unpack that a little bit and see where it may or may not be nourishing you or nourishing to others when you draw on that image or that understanding to respond to someone else who's in distress, or to care for yourself if you're in distress. So this kind of continues along my theme of spirituality and mental health and the ways in which they're related to each other, but as I said, with a particular emphasis tonight on trauma. And I draw on all kinds of wise people and their words to move my own thinking forward. And one of the wise people who I often find I resonate with is Bono from U2. So one of the best concerts I've ever been to here, for those of you who are in Southern California, at the Rose Bowl. And we were in seats with God, as I say. We were way up at the top, but had a great view of the whole night, and loved listening to him and to U2 that night. So thinking about what questions we ask and how that guides the journey that we're on as we try to understand. So let's move on to the next slide. I think that part of this was shared with you as we were opening up tonight, but I do want to just emphasize this idea of story, of narrative. All of us, whether we recognize it or not, we are writing a narrative about our own lives. In that narrative, we're doing our best to integrate and make sense of what we've been taught, explicitly, implicitly, what we've experienced, what we see happening around us, and the ways in which that does or doesn't corroborate with what we've been taught, what we've been led to expect. And in that narrative, we're always working to try and make sense of things. And I believe that narrative is a sacred story. It's sacred because it's your individual journey. It's sacred because of how essential it is to who you are. And it's sacred because we weave that story in and around our beliefs and our understanding of our relationship with God, and the ways in which we integrate moments where we felt strong, where we shone, where we felt empowered or capacity, with the offset by the moments in which we felt despair or just huge disappointment, and trying to understand the ways in which those stories are impacted by our understanding of who God is and who we are in relationship to God, is what we're going to wander through tonight. So let's see where this takes us. Let's go to the next slide, please. I've lately become a little bit more familiar with the writing and poetry of Padre Gotuma. He's a theologian and peacemaker, and he actually was part of the reunification of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Ireland, when there was so much tension, and it was rooted so deeply in religious differences. And he writes, this is an excerpted quote from a much longer piece, but he writes about how every morning he sits, kneels, waits, makes friends with the habit of listening, hoping that he's being listened to. And then I love this part. He says, I greet God, and I greet the God who is more God than the God I greet. Acknowledging right there in the moment that his vision of God, his understanding of God is incomplete, goes beyond what he knows, and yet even so, he's in this intentional process of greeting the God he does know, but with an open heart to the God that is more than the God he greets. So tonight we're going to talk about who is God, where is God in relationship to trauma. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the psychologist scientist part of the talk, and I just want to sort of lay a basic groundwork for us on what constitutes trauma and some of the sequelae to trauma. So first of all, we need to understand that trauma is a circumstance or series of circumstances that are so extreme or so impactful that they are overwhelming and literally disorienting or dislocating the individual or group of people who are being impacted by that. And by its nature, trauma is something that overwhelms our standard coping responses, whatever those might be for an individual. And that's important to understand, because what's going to be traumatic for one person is not going to be traumatic necessarily for another person. And even there, I don't want you to think that there's a certain level of trauma. It's very individualized, and we have to honor that. We really have to honor that, because just telling someone to get over it when they are overwhelmed, confused, disoriented, dislocated is completely unhelpful, and may in fact push that person further into a state of distress, because it implies a lack of support or a lack of willingness to journey with them through whatever it is they're facing. Some of the ways in which psychologists and other medical professionals talk about trauma has to do specifically with what we now call ACEs, or adverse childhood events. And this is coming out of research actually from the Kaiser Hospital system. And what they discovered is that when they asked very simple questions of people seeking medical care through the Kaiser system, so these are people who are employed or in a relationship with someone who is employed, they have insurance, this is a certain socioeconomic status. The initial sample was based largely on white men and women, adult men and women. It has since been replicated a million times with much, much more diverse samples. But what comes up over and over and over again is that there's an extraordinarily high rate of what we would consider adverse childhood experiences in the background of people who are struggling with physical illnesses. And what is being revealed by this is that chronic exposure to stressful events, traumatic events in childhood, is literally wear and tear on the immune system of the child, the developing child. In addition to having an impact on the way the brain is wiring up, it's also impacting the immune system. So we see much higher rates of, and then you can just fill in the blank, everything from obesity to substance abuse issues to heart and cardiovascular problems to diabetes, unhealthy, risky behaviors like smoking, abusing a substance, and on and on and on and on. We see earlier age of mortality, higher rates of mortality. It just goes on and on and on with these ACEs. Trauma in the ACEs category included things like violence in the home, a family member who was incarcerated, abuse, substance use by a caregiver, and I always forget the fifth one. It'll come to me and I'll bring it back to you. But those are the kinds of things that they're talking about. So you can see how that's going to have a chronic impact, okay? It's rarely a one-time event, it's much more chronic. Another kind of trauma would be a natural disaster, and those things tend to be more of a one incident kind of thing, but they have obviously a long-term impact. So you can think about the recent hurricanes, you could think about an earthquake if you're in Southern California. California, these past few months, we've been going through massive amounts of wildfires. Where I'm sitting today, we're about 2 blocks away from an an evacuation zone, a mandatory evacuation zone from the Bobcat fire. So living with that for weeks, where we were, are we evacuating? Are we not evacuating? That kind of ongoing stress, even though the fire might be considered one incident. Natural disasters are usually contrasted with traumas that are inflicted by human beings, where we perpetrate trauma against one another. And that would be things like abuse of any kind, physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, torture, war, genocide, violence in a relationship. And sadly, much of the human inflicted trauma is inflicted by someone who's known and should be someone who could have been trusted, which of course ties in very directly to the work that I do at the Archdiocese. And then there are the so-called accidental or act of God kinds of traumas. In fact, as you're adulting and looking at insurance and maybe you're looking at home insurance or renter's insurance or something, there's usually a caveat in the insurance for an act of God, that they won't insure for an act of God, meaning something that was completely out of anyone's control. So they're not going to assume liability for an act of God. And I always find it so ironic that we bring that language into our insurance policies, and in that way we bring God into that process in that way. So how do we know that someone is experiencing the aftermath of trauma? Well, interestingly enough, trauma comes under a lot of guises. It can look a lot like depression, it can look a lot like anxiety, it can look like a combination thereof. In children, it can look an awful lot like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The overlap is actually quite unsettling to me, the overlap in symptoms between someone who is a trauma survivor as a young child and someone who has ADHD. So we see problems sleeping or concentrating or thinking in a very coherent and problem-solving kind of way. We might see hypervigilance, and you often hear this in reference to, for example, a combat veteran who jumps at the sound of a backfire of a car because it sounds like a gunshot, or a slamming of a door that might sound like a gunshot. But that hypervigilance to a threat, and then a hyperreactivity to a possible threat or perceived threat, those are neurobiological responses that are actually very adaptive, if you think about it, right? If someone has chronic exposure to gunfire, then being vigilant and attention and reacting to gunfire would be a survival skill. But of course, the problem is when the combat veteran is jumping out of their skin because a door was slammed in the home, and then they're so aroused, anxiety is pegging, that they're angry and harsh and may yell at the child who slammed the door once their brain catches up to the cortex part of their brain catches up to the hindbrain, the primal part of the brain that's reacting. And they go, oh, it wasn't a gun. And then the anger comes out because they're so highly aroused. A lot of times people who are traumatized will also present on the other side of the spectrum, if you will. They're more numb. It's as if they've dissociated. They're separated or removed somehow. They can seem aloof or disconnected, or like they don't care. And internally, they may be experiencing very intrusive thoughts and memories and even flashbacks as to the original source of the trauma or sources. So you can imagine how that's going to create difficulties in relationships. It can be very hard to let your guard down and be emotionally intimate with people if you've learned that people you should be able to trust are not, in fact, trustworthy. So it can cause a lot of problems in relationships. Anniversaries of the event or other things that trigger a memory of that event. So for example, one of the things that I will often hear from a victim survivor calling me at the Archdiocese is that they're calling because their child, or sometimes even their grandchild, is now the age that they were when the abuse happened. And so that's a sort of an anniversary trigger, if you will, that has their mind and their thoughts and feelings centered again on the abuse. And it's because their child is that age or their grandchild is that age, and they're feeling the raw fear and anxiety that goes with that because they know how vulnerable they were. So one of the things I end up talking a lot about with the victim survivors who call me is how they're struggling in their parenting role because they don't want to let their child go anywhere. You know, you can't stay at grandma and grandpa's, you can't go on a sleepover with Cub Scouts, you can't, you know, nothing like that because they're so terrified that something will happen to their child. But they haven't told their child what happened to them. So the child doesn't know why mom or dad is being so difficult or so restrictive or so unfair. And there comes the strain in the relationship, right? So it's a complicated kind of thing. And this is what I mean when I say the trauma event may be a discrete one in time, but the impact, right, goes on in so many ways and at so many different levels. So being able to trust at its very core, right? When you wake up in the morning, you get out of bed, you put your feet on the floor, you trust that the floor is going to be there, right? You're counting on that. If you've lived through some of the earthquakes in California, you may have a little bit of caution about that. Maybe you have your slippers upside down under the bed so that if there's broken glass, they won't fall into the slippers, right? There's a tip for you, upside down under your bed. But you have that fundamental belief that you can stand on the floor and it's going to be there. It's going to hold you up. You have enough of a sense of trust and safety that you feel like you can do that. The person who is dealing with a history of trauma, and that's a large number of us, different elements of trust may be compromised, and it may be very, very difficult. They may be able to put their feet on the floor, but not feel so safe walking out the front door. Or they may be able to walk out the door, but not feel so safe going to lunch with people from work, because what if the conversation goes this way or that way? Or what if they ask me about this? Or what if I hear that or see a person or see something that reminds me? So for some trauma survivors, it can feel very, very scary to go out into the world at all. And to feel any sense of safety or confidence that others with you will keep you safe. Okay, so let's move on. I don't want to go too far at all into the numbers of all of this, but I just want you to take a quick note that there are estimates that as many as 70% of adults in the US have actually experienced a traumatic event in their life. That's 70%. Okay. Now, what's important to know is that most of those people are not living with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder, or with some other diagnosable mental health concern. And that's a really important thing to understand. The second stat there is more of a prevalence stat. So at any given time, it's estimated that 5% of Americans are suffering from post-traumatic stress. So that number is very low when you contrast it with the 70% who have experienced a traumatic event. So the question is, what's going on there in that difference? So we'll keep moving forward. I don't want to get too hung up on stats, but I do want you to have a sense of the scope of all this. So more stats here: 61% of men and 51% of women reporting exposure to at least one lifetime traumatic event, and 90% of clients in mental health services reporting they've experienced trauma. Again, this goes back to the high prevalence rates for traumatic experiences. Now, we think that the 61% versus 51% is a little higher for men, perhaps because of combat. And while some of that has recently changed in the military, and those numbers may shift, we also know that women will experience a high rate of violence in their lives as well. And so it's a complicated thing to unpack. But over and over and over again, what we're seeing is that when people are experiencing traumatic events, it's impacting the ways in which their brains develop, their immune systems develop, and then ultimately the way those systems are functioning. So again, it's not just a get over it. It really is learning to understand the impact it's had and then unpacking that, because we actually have some amazing evidence-based treatments and interventions that are very good at turning that around. But by and large, mental health interventions for trauma revolve around exposure to the trauma, meaning you have to talk about it, you have to think about it, you have to remember it. And that's very hard for a lot of people to do. And so not everybody is able or feels strong enough to engage in it. So let's go forward. What I want to focus on a little bit more here now is the impact in terms of more psychological or personal experiences of it, guilt, shame, fear of not being believed, those kinds of things, because one of the things that can feed into or help to offset and foster healing is the way in which we think about God and our relationship to God. And so if we're carrying a lot of guilt or shame or a fear that we won't be believed, we won't be recognized, that's a very painful way to go out and function. And if that is reinforced by the way in which you think about God, it may be very isolating. But if it's challenged by the way you think about God, then it could be that you can be freed from that. So let's move on. And this is just another statement to the effect of the impact. And I really do want to underscore here that this is neurological research. I mean, this is not armchair research. This is looking at functional MRIs and watching how the brain lights up when a memory of a traumatic experience is being recalled by a person who's sitting in the MRI machine. And we watch how the brain is functioning. And it really is amazing to see how our brains will organize around our lived experience in order to help us thrive. But in many cases of chronic abuse, it's literally trying to help us survive, and thriving is further down the line. But what happens then is if you have a brain that's wired for pain, for vigilance, for threat detection, your brain isn't able to develop to its full potential in other realms. And that's where we start to see the impact of trauma pulling kids and pulling people out of what would have been a normal trajectory in their lives and taking them to a place where they're limited, where they're in distress, and where they may be largely misunderstood. For example, ADHD being misdiagnosed when instead what we have is a trauma survivor. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to watch my time here a little bit. Okay. I titled this Living Through Trauma, and I think that's a really important thing to just think about for a moment, because first there's the event, or there are the series of events. If you are being exposed to a chronic trauma like sexual abuse by a known and trusted adult, or physical abuse by a caregiver or a coach or something along those lines. So first there's the trauma, but then there's the aftermath of the trauma. Did you get in trouble for being late or for your clothes being torn or dirty? Did you get in trouble for walking where you walked when the attack happened? Did you get berated for not doing something or blamed for something that is being held up as an explanation for why the event happened? And I know this was something that I would struggle with as a parent. I'm the mom of 2 daughters, and I sent them off into the world, and I talked to them about things like, please don't walk alone at night. Please don't walk in places like X, Y, or Z at night. And I found myself thinking, I'm doing that to keep them safe. But why aren't we focusing on the dangers that exist there and eliminating them rather than limiting my daughter and where she can walk and feel safe? And that's a tension that's not an easy one to resolve. And I obviously opted for the let's do everything we can to keep you safe part. But the trauma and then the aftermath of it is part of what we're weaving into our narrative. So if we are survivors of some kind of chronic trauma exposure in childhood, that's woven into our sense of self, our sense of place in the world, and our sense of value, our sense of self-worth. And if we disclosed and were believed, that story is going to move in one way. If we disclosed and were not believed, that story can move in a very different direction. If we were debating disclosure and overheard something, or were manipulated by a perpetrator who said, you know, if you tell anybody this, they're going to take you away from your family, or I'm going to make sure your mom loses her job, or I'll stop providing, or whatever it might be, that threat or that manipulation, then the child doesn't disclose. And so all of this is being internalized and they're trying to make sense of it completely on their own. So the narrative that we're building about our lives, it's incredibly powerful. And it has a power to both transform or to trap, really to isolate. And you add that story, if you will, and I don't mean that as a diminishment at all, but that story that you're trying to create around what's happening to you, you add that onto the lived experience and what it's doing to your brain and your body and your neurology and your biology of immunity and so forth. There's a whole lot going on there. And you can see, I hope, how it's impacting you across the board. It really is touching on every element of who you are. So in trying to intervene for someone who's been living through a trauma, I say this over and over again, it really becomes a question of how are we going to integrate this trauma into the narrative, and how much impact can we have on how much space that trauma occupies in that narrative. Does it have to dominate? Does it have to define? Or can it be something that is acknowledged and recognized, but occupies a smaller part of the sense of who somebody is? And this is a very delicate space to move in, because you know, you may be familiar with a sort of traditional 12-step model where somebody is at a meeting and they stand up and they say, "Hi, I'm Heather, I'm an alcoholic." And that's an important part for them, and in a 12-step program, of recognizing and owning the issue that this person has had with alcohol. But I'm always loath to define anybody as a something ick, like an alcoholic or a schizophrenic or a depressive or anything like that. I'm very loath to do that, because I am confident that the person is more than that. So that's what I mean by how much space it's going to occupy and how dominant it's going to be. But at the same time, who am I to say how much space that should be? And if it is dominating, it's not my place at all to say it shouldn't, but it is my hope that one day it won't dominate. And that's really what I strive towards in terms of my clinical interventions. So let's move on and go to the next slide, and talk a little bit now, as we move forward, about the ways in which the sacred texts that we reference, that we cling to in our faith tradition, intersect with the sacred stories of the trauma, and how the ways in which we talk about our faith and our trauma, the ways in which we envision them or see them in our mind's eye, and how they fit together and hold that, and whether it's being held in a way that is promoting of health and well-being and reconciliation and closeness to God, or if it's being held in a way that pushes that apart or makes that creates obstacles to that reconciliation and reunification with God. So that's sort of the realm of trauma-sensitive theology, and that's what we're going to dive into next. So let's go on to the next slide and start by really just asking you to think for a moment. I've got a couple of ideas up here on the slide, but ask you to think for a moment about, you know, when you say that you're a person of faith, when you say that you believe in God, what is it that you hold in your mind's eye as who God is, or what God is, where God is, and where is God in relationship to you? Now, these quotes come from Ron Rolheiser, Father Ron Rolheiser, who many of you may know. He's a wonderful writer and theologian, in my opinion. And I love this quote from him about God being deep inside us, but often in a way that we may not feel as tangible or as aware of as we might like. But he says, while that presence is never overpowering, it has within it a gentle, unremitting imperative, a compulsion towards something higher, which invites us to draw upon it. And that's a very positive framing of what would be called theological anthropology, or of the relationship between God and humanity. It's a very ascending or low Christology, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. So it's an invitation and a building on something within us that is a part of us, that God is a part of us. And that's a very important image, and one that very much resonates for me. And I love his analogy here, that it lies there precisely like a baby, helpless in the straw, gently beckoning us, but helpless in itself to make us pick it up. So there really is an invitation to engage, but not an expectation. There's no club coming down on your head, or lightning bolt, so to speak, going, hey, over here, pay attention. All right, let's move on. This next quote comes from Serene Jones, and she was at Yale Divinity School. She's now the president, actually, of the Union Theological School. And she writes again about this sense of presence and God's grace being available to us regardless of how coherent we are. And you may recall that's a word I was using in the beginning when I was talking about bringing all of my different educational experiences and clinical experiences together in alignment with one another, this sense of coherence. And she really emphasizes that regardless of how coherent we're feeling, God is present with us. And Merton, you know, who is so famous for so many of his remarkable writings, God is present even if sometimes it seems as if he's absent. And if we do not know him well, we do not realize that he may be more present to us when he is absent than when he is present. That takes some pondering. I don't expect you to just accept that hook, line, and sinker. But what's really important to me about that quote, again, in relationship to the clergy abuse victim survivors, is that that's a trauma that is made unique because it happened in the context of the person's faith tradition, right? They're sent to church, brought to church, taken to church, going to church, with family. This is a part of who they are, and that's where the trauma happened. And so how could God have been present and allowed this to happen? Where was God when this was happening? And then what implications does that have for the person who was harmed, if God is a loving God or a benevolent God or an all-powerful, omnipotent God? Again, getting at the ways in which you think about God and what attributes you recognizing God can have a whole range of impacts on how that then helps you cope with the trauma that you experience. So let's move on. Okay, so here's where I started diving into this idea of trauma-informed theology. and looking at how it is we understand God and the beliefs that we hold as Catholics, and are those ideas and are those understandings sustaining us, or in fact could they be re-traumatizing us? And that led me to reading some very interesting research and reflections by the women that are named there: Jennifer Baldwin, Shelley Rambo, Serene Jones, and Judith Herman. The first three are all theologians. Judith Herman is actually a trauma psychologist. So she's one of the first trauma psychologists whose work I studied when I was beginning my training. So what's interesting here is that Baldwin, Rambo, and Jones and Herman, they all touch upon the language that's used, the images that are used, and then in terms of the theology, the rush to redemption and resurrection. And this is something that turned out to be very interesting to me, because certainly in the Passion of Christ, we have an experience, an image of horrible trauma being perpetrated on an individual, with vicarious trauma being perpetrated on all those who witness or were a part of it. And then we have all of our beliefs and understandings of what happened through the crucifixion, through Jesus's death on the cross, Holy Saturday, the descent into hell, and then the triumphant resurrection on Easter Sunday. And what's interesting is that because of that, a lot of the language and imagery that gets offered to a trauma survivor is in this resurrection kind of model. And as it turns out, you don't have one resurrection from a trauma like chronic child sexual abuse. It's not one epiphany and then everything's okay afterwards. And what more and more trauma survivors of faith have been able to describe to us, and what Baldwin, Rambo, and Jones reflect on, is the idea that really for a trauma survivor, much of the time you feel like you're living in that Holy Saturday space, that a part of you has died from the trauma that's been inflicted on you. And you're anticipating the resurrection because you know the resurrection story and your faith is a story of redemption, but it's hard to grab hold of, and it's hard to hang on to even if you do grab hold of it for a while. So this trauma-informed theology is about trying to look at some of those images and those stories as how they relate to someone who's experiencing the kind of trauma where they feel abandoned by God, where they can't see God in their suffering. And in particular, for my work with the church, where God may have been entangled into the abuse by virtue of the fact that the perpetrator was clergy. And then on top of that, because some clergy really manipulated and desecrated the church further by contextualizing the abuse in, this is what God would want, I'm doing God's will, I'm God's priest, and laying that on top of the actual acts that were being perpetrated. The other thing that's really important to remember is that sometimes our theological language and understanding is very abstract, is very symbolic, and it may be inspirational and it may be descriptive, but it doesn't feel connected to the very embodied experience of the trauma, where your heart is racing, where you may be injured, where you may have chronic pain, where you may have shame, where you may have guilt, and that those are all experienced in a very physical way. And for some of the language and the imagery that may be offered in very well-intentioned efforts to help somebody heal or to support somebody, it may actually be really denying or negating that embodiment piece of it. And that's important to be aware of as well. And then finally, to think about the fact that there's betrayal in a trauma that's inflicted by a human being, especially a known and trusted adult. And betrayal violates that trust. And if you don't know where God was in all of that, you can feel betrayed by God. So being quick to say, you know, ask for God's forgiveness or forgive the perpetrator can be very dangerous. So let's move on. So what I want to make you at least a little bit familiar with is this idea of ascending or low Christology and descending or high Christology. And that's one of the basic distinctions we can make in terms of our understanding of the relationship between God and us as humans, as humanity. And if you take a more descending high Christology approach to things, you're talking about God as the king, you're talking about God up above in heaven, God is removed. It's really through the grace of God that we are saved. It has nothing to do with what we do per se, but it's God's grace. In a more ascending or low Christology, the humanity of Christ is more emphasized. It's a more bodily or rooted experience sort of on earth. And Christ becomes more of the fullest, most complete actualization of the divine and human that God envisions for us as human beings. And so here it is more of a collaborative or a relational experience between humanity and God. It's not so supernatural, it's not so remote, it's not so hierarchical. And there's a moving up towards one another in an ascending Christology between God and humanity, whereas with descending, it's more God sort of reaching down to us. And it's not to say that one is better than the other, or one is right or one is wrong. And in fact, if you dig deep in the theology of both of those, you can find flaws or challenges to very core beliefs. And I'm certainly not saying pick one or the other, but I'm suggesting to you that if you think about sort of the way in which you primarily think about who God is in relationship to you and to humanity, you may find that there are places there where a focus or a lack of focus is part of what's creating a barrier between the individual and God, especially as they're trying to heal from trauma. So let's move on. I really sort of discussed this already in my quick overview, but high Christology or descending Christology really is creating more, if you will, separation and distinction between humanity and God, and more obstacle, if you will, between us or potentially between us. Requiring divine intervention to overcome. Whereas on the next slide, when we talk a little bit more about ascending or low Christology, if we can go to the next one, there we go. What we see is that there's a focus that's more emphasis on how close God is to us because Christ was divine as well as human. And so that's integrated, that's existing in him, and in our fullest realization of potential, we would be Christ-like in that way, that we're capable of that kind of transcendence, of reaching towards God in that way. And this work is work that's being done in particular by Dr. Anastasia Wendlander, who's a theologian up at Gonzaga. So I had the privilege of being able to study with her for a while and learn more about this. And I encourage you to look into it if it is resonating for you. So let's go on. In a more ascending Christology, in that sort of a perspective, sin is less about moral failing and more about an abuse of relational power. And if you think about trauma, at least trauma that's perpetrated by humans, what we see is an abuse of relational power, right? The priest had power over the child. The stronger, physically stronger person has power over the physically weaker person in a relationship. The employer has power over the employee. You know, go down the line and you can see how in human perpetrated trauma, so much of what is happening is an abuse of power. And it's manifesting perhaps in physical violence or sexual violence or emotional violence, but it's this abuse of relational power. And so thinking about sin that way is very different than thinking about sin as not following a rule, like eating the apple from a tree that you were told not to, okay? And that changes the way we think about sin. And that's important because that idea of original sin is something that a lot of victim survivors that I'm working with, especially because they're older and their catechism was very traditional, you know, they see themselves as stained or as having this failing regardless of what they've done. And that can lead to internalizing those feelings of belief that somehow they were responsible or to blame for what happened to them, as opposed to blaming the person who perpetrated. So if you go back to my example about, you know, do I teach my girls not to walk in dangerous places, or do we teach the people who are perpetrating not to commit those kinds of acts, right? And it's a different question. Back to my quote from Bono, it's what questions are we asking? So let's go on. So if we look at ways in which Christ is present, right? Moving from God to now the idea of presence. If we look at the way in which Christ is present, one of the things that trauma-informed theology can help us to see is that Jesus never abused relational power, never abused relational power. And in that, what he's demonstrating, what he's modeling for us there is how to exist in right relationship, okay? So that even when he was experiencing the trauma of his arrest, his punishment, his sentencing, his crucifixion, even during all of that time, he stays in right relationship to people, right? So modeling that and right relationship to God, right? So there's a healthy relationship there in the midst of all the trauma. And if we look at that example, that takes us to a very different place. That sense of presence and interrelationship with one another takes us to a different place. And it takes us to a different place for the victim survivor, who instead of seeing themselves as somehow deserving of this abuse, right? So many people in domestic violence relationships or interpersonal violence relationships somehow feel deserving of that abuse. And the person who's perpetrating may in fact say, you know, I do this to you because you're stupid, or because you didn't do this, or, you know, you never do that. And that's an abuse of relational power. So if we reframe as abuse of relational power, instead of a failing in that individual, something that made them deserve that kind of treatment, you can see how that opens up different possibilities for how you understand the trauma. So let's go forward. And again, the wonderful theologian Bono, with Christ, we have access to this one-to-one relationship. As in the Old Testament, it was more one of worship and awe. That's the vertical he's referencing. And then the New Testament, we look across at a Jesus who's familiar, and that's the horizontal, the combination of which makes up the cross. It's kind of an interesting image. But it brings us back to that idea of ascending and descending Christology. I'm really not saying one is right and one is wrong, but look at the two and how they fit together, and what makes sense to you in relation to experiences that perhaps you struggle with in your own lives. So let's go forward. Okay, talking for a moment about resilience, all right? Without a doubt, some people are more resilient than others. And that's an observation that is made manifest over and over again, you know, 5 people can be in the same car and have the same car accident, and their reactions to it psychologically, emotionally, as well as physically are all going to be different. And then how many of them can get right back to work or not back to work, taking out of it for the moment physical injury. Okay. Resilience is something that is unique to each of us. It's a combination of what we're born with and what we learn. And that's really positive and hopeful, because we can't do a whole lot about what we're born with, but there's a lot we can do about what we can learn. But what kinds of things are we born with? Well, sometimes we're born with a nervous system that is more sensitive or more quick to react, quick to get pegged or to amp up. And that's partly to do with genetics, and then that's partly to do with an environmental intersection with our genetics. So for example, if we take, there's a number of studies done where they did foster parenting with monkeys, and monkeys who were born with this more reactive nervous system were fostered by what they called super monkey moms. And these are moms who were calm and skilled and very good at helping the baby monkeys navigate a stressful environment. And so their nervous systems tended to react more slowly over time. Whereas a sibling from that same birth of the amped up monkey who stays with its mom, who may not be a super mom, they may be more reactive and having a more difficult time. So it's the combination of what's innate and what we're able to learn. The great thing is that we can cultivate a lot of resilience in people, and these are some of the skills that go into it. And what's interesting to me is how much spirituality is a significant component of resilience, because a big part of it is making sense out of what's happening to us, finding meaning in what's happened to us, and being able to transcend the experience to that more transformative level of meaning and purpose. And so we're studying that now, as opposed to my early training, which was so secular, as I mentioned to you before. So let's move on. When we talk about resilience in the context of trauma-sensitive theology, what's important here to remember is that sometimes the ways in which we're talking about God and God's presence or perceived lack of presence can be crucial to how someone is coping. And unfortunately, there are far too many times where a well-intentioned person of faith, a clergy member, will say something like, your faith must not be very strong if you're still so depressed about that, right? God is good, God is healing you, kind of move on, right? It's another way of saying move on, but it's contextualized in this, your faith must not be strong if you're still depressed or if you're still anxious. And this is just really, really disempowering. It's a mislabeling of a process of coping and a process of healing. And to say that this person on top of it all now has a lack of faith, or that their faith is weak, is further perpetuating that trauma against them. Likewise, you know, how many times have people said, oh, God never gives us more than we can handle, right? Well, that's maybe one thing if you're having to juggle cooking and writing a paper and feeding the cat and, you know, cleaning up after the dog who didn't get taken out on time or whatever. That's okay. Maybe that's stuff to handle. But if what you're handling is chronic child sexual abuse, there really is nothing redeemable in that. It's not a moment for you to know how good God is because you've experienced chronic child sexual abuse. So to use that kind of language or use that kind of framing can actually be even more damaging. And what's at the heart of all of this is, when we experience a trauma, whether it's the earth moving under our feet in an earthquake, or a horrible plane crash, or chronic child sexual abuse. We're struggling in our narrative to make sense of that, to figure out what that means. And a huge part of that is our faith and our beliefs. So if the message that we're getting is that our faith is weak, or that God is trying to teach us something by inflicting this or allowing this to be inflicted, and now we're talking about a very descending Christology kind of model, it's just incredibly dangerous. And what I find so powerful in my work is that those people who are able to separate the priest who harmed them from the church and from God are the ones who are healing the most completely and the more expeditiously. For those for whom the priest is still very tangled up with, this is, God's representative on earth, they're really still struggling with that, because then it feels like God has perpetrated against them. And that's, how do you make sense of that, right? You could say, well, maybe God gave me a challenge so that I could learn something about myself. Okay, so child sexual abuse is a challenge to reveal something, it just makes no sense. And so when we're using that kind of language and framing of faith, we're really losing that other person, and missing a huge opportunity to help them heal. So let's go forward. I feel like I'm really running out of time here, because we're supposed to be going into breakout sessions soon, I think. So I want to make sure I move forward here. But one of the key ideas that I found so compelling as I did this research for this trauma-informed theology work is an idea I'd never heard of before. It's coined, the term is coined by Rita Nakashima Brock, who I've actually heard speak once. And she coined this term of original grace. And it sort of stands in contrast to the idea of original sin. And the important thing here is to recognize, not that we're trying to obviate that there's sin and that human beings sin at all, but so often I hear from victim survivors this sense of somehow this is a punishment. I've done something to deserve this, or I wasn't enough, and that's why this happened to me and not to my classmate, as people are trying to make sense of this. And the idea of original sin sort of leaves the victim survivor stranded. But the idea of original grace, this idea that there is something in us from the beginning that was good, that was God-given, and that can be reclaimed, right? That it doesn't have to be obliterated by the trauma that's happened. That was a really powerful concept. And it separates out this idea of guilt or responsibility. So the person who's feeling lost to God or abandoned by God, and looking at that in the context of original sin, may be internalizing some sense of responsibility for what happened to them. And this is particularly complicated, for example, when sexual abuse is perpetrated against an adolescent who is going through a developmental stage of sexual development that's very specific and can be easily manipulated. So a child who's exposed to some pornography, then the perpetrator sees them responding to the pornography and manipulates that situation. Now the adolescent feels complicit, feels to blame, even though they've been manipulated, right? That idea of original sin sort of just holds that right there for you. See, you sinned. Or the person who walks where their mother told them not to walk and then gets assaulted. See, you sinned. You didn't do what you were told. You broke the rules. And there's this blame that is claimed by the victim survivor. But with original grace, that grace may feel like it's been dimmed or damaged, but it doesn't have with it that accompanying sort of psychological baggage of responsibility, and it's more easily reclaimed perhaps by the person who's been harmed. So an interesting idea to think about, and in addition to the framework of how we might talk to a victim survivor who's coping with the trauma that that's overwhelming them. So let's move on. One of my favorite authors, if you don't know her already, Sue Monk Kidd, she wrote The Secret Life of Bees, which is an amazing book. I used to teach it in my classes when I was still teaching at Occidental. And she's a Protestant woman. She wrote The Dance of the Dissident Daughter, which is on feminist theology. And she writes about what I would call original grace, the sacred intent of life of God to move us continuously towards growth, toward recovering all that's lost and orphaned within us, and restoring the divine image imprinted on our souls. That's original grace right there, as only Sue could say. All right, let's move on. Okay. Finally, let's talk about hope. And we'll wrap it up here. And then I'm going to just ask you to go into your breakout groups and let you ponder this and play around with it. What musings have arisen in you as you think about this? I do believe that this sense of original grace is both reassuring and rooting for us. It allows us a starting place that is going to build resiliency, because it's a sense of worth, and it allows us to connect easily with God and with others without the shame or obstacle of sin and of that brokenness, that diminished value or worth that we can feel. So it starts us in this place of being fundamentally enough. If we go to the next slide, if we look at coming out of not just hope, but into thriving, I'm very intentional in my language, as I hope you can see. I talk about a victim survivor, because to say just victim feels to me like it locks someone there. To say just survivor feels to me like it denies what the person has been through. But now what is coming out from victim survivors is the idea of being a victim survivor thriver. And I love that. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's worth every hyphen that goes into it. Because what we're learning about thriving is that when psychologists like the very famous Martin Seligman at UPenn, in the positive psychology program, what we find is that positive emotions, being able to engage and be in relationship, finding meaning, right? Finding meaning is what leads to well-being. It's not just happy, like, oh, I'm happy, but it's really a deep and profound sense of well-being. And that meaning and those relationships, that ability to engage, that is all something that can be contained within our faith, if our faith isn't actually creating obstacles for us instead. So let's go to the next slide. So here, taking from the secular where we began to now research into what's called spiritual fortitude. Notice that this researcher, if you look at item C here, allowing one's spiritual beliefs to be shaped in part by the reality of their hardship, a willingness to revise beliefs that simply don't hold up to reality. So Ron Rolheiser talks about what he calls the Paschal imagination, and the cycle that we go through in the Paschal mystery of death and the descent and resurrection, the grief and loss that goes, and then the coming of Pentecost and the new spirit, the new life that comes. As we go through that Paschal cycle, we may go over it many, 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 many times. It isn't this one-time resurrection. That's a willingness to revise beliefs that don't hold up to reality. The trauma survivor doesn't go, aha, God is good, I'm saved, all done. The trauma survivor is going to get triggered. The trauma survivor is someday going to have a child that same age, or another person who tries to treat them as the perpetrator did, or get back in a car and drive when they were in a bad accident. There are going to be things that bring it up again and again and again. And this ability to have fortitude, because you can allow your spirituality to grow in the context of this lived experience, in the context of a more ascending Christology, may be a very powerful way to access that. So let's go to the next slide. I think we're almost at the very end. And what I'd like to ask you to do is think about what changes you might make in the way in which you originally envisioned God, as we talked at the beginning of the evening tonight, or as I said at the beginning of the evening tonight. And how do you, in your search for the sacred, how do you think maybe you might change something, or change the way in which you frame something, either for yourself or for someone you care about? And I'll leave you with that idea to go into the breakout groups. And you've got moderators, and I think I'm going to move from group to group a little bit with the help of this amazing tech team. And then we'll come back at the end to hear a little bit about what you've been thinking about.
Be helpful to explore or build on.
Did you say protective factors?
Yeah, protective factors.
Yes, there are. There are all kinds of things that protect us, not necessarily from not experiencing trauma, but from being able to respond or cope with trauma more effectively. A huge piece of what we've learned about what a trauma survivor needs is actually very humbling for me as a clinician, and that is for the clinicians to stay out of the way, at least initially, because the most healing part that can happen is if a trauma survivor is fortunate to be embedded in a social network, family, friends, combination thereof, that is a loving, attuned, supportive network. And so almost regardless of what the trauma experience is, if that person can then be reintegrated, right, embraced, welcomed back into that loving space, that will do a huge amount to help the person coping with post-traumatic stress. An interesting example of that is that typically we see higher rates of PTSD when the trauma is perpetrated by humans than when the trauma is perpetrated by natural disaster kind of thing, or act of God, so to speak. And one of the interesting contradictions to that was looking at the rates of PTSD in New York City after 9/11 versus the rates in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Okay, so the hurricane would be the natural disaster, the act of God, and 9/11 would be the human perpetrated. So you would expect that the PTSD would be higher in New York City and lower in New Orleans. And in fact, we saw the flip of that. And the reasons we think that that happened are because of the kind of response and mobilization and attention and practical support that was pouring into New York City post 9/11 versus the disruption to fragile social structures and economically deprived areas and inadequate government procedures and policies and planning and so forth, all wrapped into one in Katrina. So, people were responding to 9/11 within minutes, and people weren't responding to Katrina for days in terms of outside help and resources. So that loving and secure context is what is one of the hugest protective factors that we have. So are things like having a positive outlook in life, all the resilience factors, which you can go to the American Psychological Association website, Google American Psych Association resilience, and you'll come up with all kinds of wonderful, very accessible materials about things that constitute resilience, like a positive outlook, good problem-solving skills, being able to restore a sense of meaning, and so forth. And those are all elements in that. So we don't actually diagnose PTSD for at least 30 days after the trauma, because the other thing to understand is that it is normal, healthy, appropriate, predictable, expected that if you're traumatized, you're going to have a reaction to it. And you may be sad and scared and anxious and distracted and hypervigilant and so forth. But if those things don't calm down and start to resolve and dissipate within that 30 days, then we start to look at, okay, is somebody struggling here? That doesn't mean that we don't help or support someone in the first 30 days, but the best help and support may, quite honestly, come from loving family and friends and that network, more so than a professional coming in to offer expertise. That may be more needed to add to the loving support in the aftermath, at least a month later. The problem is a lot of our human perpetrated traumas are perpetrated within those social networks that we're supposed to feel safe and loved and secure. And that's what is, excuse me, that's what's so disorienting, right? When church is the place that you're supposed to be close to God and instead you experience abuse, or family is the place where it's supposed to be safe and instead you're being violated and betrayed. That's when things get really complicated. The other thing that complicates that is that all of those biological changes that are happening in our bodies because of trauma, then that gets passed on. That monkey that was born that was more readily agitated or easily amped up, they're inheriting a predisposition towards that, in part that comes from perhaps a traumatized parent. And so one of the greatest protective factors that you can give a child to get all psychological on you is a secure attachment with a primary caregiver early in life. Usually that's a parent or parents, hopefully, but it can be a caregiver. We know that kids who are at great risk, if they have one adult in their life, just one is all it takes, who is safe, who does not exploit them, who looks out for them, who encourages them, that's a huge protective factor. So even if horrible things are happening, if there is that one person that they can connect to, who sees and makes possible and protects as much as they can, that can make a huge difference in the impact of the trauma.
Thank you. I think it was great that you mentioned that trauma happens, like, and you can't avoid trauma, but you can find ways to deal with trauma, because you know, that's so important to people who might be experiencing feeling like I'm alone. Why is this happening to me? And so it's a great point. Thank you. A participant asked, when you were introducing low and high Christology, you're suggesting that there wasn't an objective right or wrong. So could you clarify that? And also any tips for people who are struggling to conceptualize and relate to Jesus in that way, versus low versus, you know, high Christology?
Well, I think my disclaimer, as far as I'm not saying right or wrong, really primarily has to do with the fact that when you really dig in deep on either of those perspectives, the low or the high, the ascending or descending, it creates other theological problems. So I personally am much more drawn to and aligned with a low ascending Christology than I am the high descending Christology. I'm also drawn to what you would call a positive theological anthropology, or positively framed relationship between God and humanity, versus a more punitive, controlling, negative theological anthropology. So I'm very drawn in those directions. But when you do dig in deep, and it goes far beyond my ability to really do it justice, and the time we have tonight, we'd be here for next week. It raises other theological problems in terms of, is it a problem? Some people think it's almost blasphemy to think that humans would have any divinity in them. Some people really struggle with the idea that Christ's humanity is emphasized. They need Christ to be more divine. That's not my struggle, personally. Not to say that I completely understand how those things are all reconciled, but I didn't want to open this discussion at all with there's a right and a wrong way. And if we had a panel of theologians here, there could be plenty of debate about either perspective. But as I said in my talk, and as we were talking a little bit offline while the breakouts were going on, there are things that have always nagged at me that just didn't reconcile for me with my belief in a God who is loving. I struggled with the puppeteer idea, of God made this happen and is pulling strings. I struggle with that. I struggle a lot with the Old Testament in terms of the punitive, controlling nature that is attributed to God. I'm much more of a New Testament person than an Old Testament person. But that's not to say that's right or wrong. I really feel like that's very presumptuous. But for me, and for what I'm tuning into in the trauma survivors that I've worked with over the years, there's no comfort in thinking that God caused this or God sent this so that I could be a stronger person, or it just doesn't add up to me that a loving God would send child sexual abuse by a priest into the life of a child so that they could, I can't even finish that sentence. And I think the incarnational piece of who Christ is very important to me. That image of the baby in the straw who invites but doesn't demand, in fact, can't make it happen. The fact that Jesus was born, and in the setting and time and place that he was, in all those ways, it's just so humbling. And it doesn't reconcile with the way my heart and mind work and my sense of who God is, to think of God in that more royal, regal way. And I really do, I resonated with the idea of sin as a breakdown in my relationship with God, but that seemed a little too abstract for a lot of sin for me. And then thinking about sin as the abuse of relational power, that just clicked completely into place for me, with lived experience and with clinical experience and with a larger sort of theological perspective. But my life experience and my perspective is mine, and it's legit as far as that goes, but that's not to say that it would fit for someone else, and I wouldn't want to presume that. In my program, I had a chance to read some liberation theology, some feminist theology, to delve into that to a bit, and I could follow the arguments, but some parts would resonate more than others, and that doesn't mean that it's less meaningful. It's just maybe not my access to who God is, or not as immediately accessible, and it may be something that I need to grow towards before it's going to resonate for me. I have a friend who there was a group that was gathering to pray the rosary, and I find the rosary very stressful. It does not help me at all. Some people are just, it's like, oh, that takes them to this place and they're good. I'm like, wait, did I do it 9 times or 10? In which I am so stressed over that. I'm not good at the rosary at all. And so I confessed that to her one day after one of these groups that I was just all frazzled after. And she's like, well, isn't it great that there's so many ways to God and the rosary isn't the only one? And that was it. And she loves praying the rosary. And I know so many people who do. And I have some beautiful rosaries that have been given to me over the years. But that's just not my path. And so that doesn't mean the rosary's bad. I have no qualifications whatsoever to even hint at that, nor would I want to. So that was really my disclaimer. And I also know that challenging people's beliefs can also be very destabilizing. So I don't want to rob anybody of their understanding of original sin and how the world is organized around that. But I do want to challenge you to think about that, and think about how you're defining sin and how that situates you in relationship to God. Because I think all of these concepts, all of these beliefs, all of our rituals, our traditions, our prayers, our rosaries, if they're not speaking to us, then we have to ask why. And is it because we aren't fully engaging and giving it its full due, or is it because it really isn't relevant? And I think for me, the rosary creates stress. That's not worth it for me right now. I've got enough stress. Don't we all have enough stress? But I wouldn't ever want to say to somebody, "Oh, the rosary is stressful. Don't do it." That's the line I was drawing there. And because I do believe fundamentally that God is love and is a loving God, then I have to make room for that. And that means some things aren't going to work as well for me. But I don't want to just rob somebody of their belief system without them having some process at least to rebuild it and think about it. So I offer original grace as something to incorporate in, to consider and see how that sits. And maybe it'll shift an emphasis and a balance, maybe not. But it certainly is relevant and resonant in my world personally, and in my world in terms of my ministry.
Thank you. As young adults, at least for me, this has been my faith journey, has been my young adult time, figuring out what my faith means to me as an adult, instead of, growing up in the church, and just that time to ask those questions and understand your relationship with Jesus and Christ, God. So we appreciate you introducing those new concepts, because I had never heard of several of the things you talked about today. Well, thank you so much. We know that there are some more questions that were submitted, but we haven't had a chance to get to. Dr. Banis has been so kind and generous with her time, and is open to responding to people reaching out to her after today's presentation. And we'll have her contact information on the slide in a few moments. It's just asked that you be patient in her response times. Thank you.